If your websites conduct transactions or collect sensitive data, you have a material risk on your hands that could cost millions. The client-side security gap is being exploited daily with attacks like digital skimming, credential harvesting, and form jacking. 98% of sites use first and third-party JavaScript to power and enhance the user experience, opening up the client side to the adversary. Unlike most things in security, there is an easy fix. Start by understanding your risk. Let Source Defense give you a site-wide risk report this week. Visit securityweekly.com/source defense. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. If you have a specific guest or topic you'd like us to cover on one of the upcoming shows, submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests. If you have a topic, you have to hack the form to figure out how to put a topic suggestion instead of a guest. We do review those on a weekly basis and get back to everyone that submits the form. I've got a whole new set of hosts with me for this segment. Mr. Adrian Sanabria is joining us. Adrian, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Paul. As I choke,
it's good to have you, man. Don't choke. We're short on hosts.
Good sign. I immediately choke when you announce me.
It's okay. You're here, and we're thankful. Yes, Mr. Lee Neely, we're thankful to have you on the show as well.
Oh, it's good to be here. And did you hear about the cheese that's been working out? The dude is shredded.
Shredded. That's amazing dad jokes.
Wow.
Amazing dad jokes. A lot of good stories to cover this week, though. I liked your story number one, Lee, that came in. So there's a Hacktivist site that lets you prank call Russian officials. I mean, this is a throwback to like 90s hacking and like Woz calling up the Pope and stuff.
I thought this was like, is this something that John Strand whipped up? Because this is like up his kind of alley to just have fun with people. But yeah, it's legit. This group said, hey, let's have it prank call the Russian officials, just chew up their time and trouble. And then, I mean, ideally it'd be nice if it was a collect call or something that would cost them money, but whatever. I just thought it was fun and silly. And you know what? There's a lot of dour out there. We need light news.
I agree.
Even the domain is just on point. It's just excellent. It's wasterussiantime.today.
Yeah.
Who'd have thunk like cyber warfare would manifest itself into this?
Yeah, I know. I mean, this almost reminds me of like a John Oliver last week tonight level prank. Like, how he'll report on a story and then he's like, but that's not all. Like, we actually, took ad time in their, where they live on their TV channels. Like he just takes the prank all the way.
I mean, that's the only way to prank. Speaking of pranks, I want to talk about CVSS. How's that for a segue?
Yeah.
Wow, that was rough.
So, CVE 2022-1654. You guys are familiar with that one, right? No, I'm just kidding. I actually counted. I went for my other story.
Does it have a logo? Does it have a name or a
no?
Song
There's no logo, song, and a dance.
Then what do I care?
CVE Details now tracks 176,000 plus CVEs. Did I read that right? I feel like I counted wrong. I feel like it wasn't that high before.
No, so CVE hadn't even hit 100. I didn't think. Are they pulling in from other places other than CVE?
I don't know.
Well, no, that is MITRE. Yeah, because that was always VulnDB's big thing. Jake Koons and risk-based security was that they had like tens of thousands more records than CVE had. But yeah, that's a big jump.
Yeah, I thought that was a big jump since I last checked. In any case, one of those, CVE 2022-1654, is rated as a 9.9. Any authenticated attacker. Now I'm going to stop right there. How does something score as a 9.9 if it requires authentication? I didn't.
No, this has been one of my biggest frustrations forever. Is that there's nothing in the CVE score that distinguishes between remote code execution, privilege escalation, denial of service. You can have a 10 in each of those categories, But obviously, like you're probably like most people are going to be more worried about an RCE than privilege escalation.
Right.
But it depends on what you're running and where. Like some of these exploits, you look at them and you're like, how is that a 10? Until you start thinking like your AWS or your Google Cloud or your Azure or something like that, where multiple customers are using the same box, and you're like, if it's a container escape or something like that.
I just thought it was weird. It could score a 9.9 and still be authenticated. Now, authenticated in this case for WordPress means a subscriber or customer level attacker, right? Because if you create an account, so maybe if you've got a WordPress instance and anyone can create an account as a customer, that's all you need. Okay, so I guess if authenticated means that the user can like self-subscribe, that's pretty much like having an unauthenticated one. So I think I might have just justified it if that's what we're really getting at in this case.
Yeah, it's got to be a multi-tenant situation for this to really be something that you're freaking out about.
And this was in sites with a theme. This was more of a theme. I read this more as a theme vulnerability than a plugin.
Right. I mean, this is the theme vulnerability. And this one, like a lot of the other ones, the WAF rules are going to save your butt if somebody's trying to get it. It seems to be a recurring theme for WordPress. Have a WAF in front of it that's kept updated.
Yeah.
Unless you've like stripped it down to like nearly nothing, there's going to be something vulnerable.
But also realize that your theme is really just like another plugin, because your theme can contain oftentimes contains PHP files, which is essentially code that's executing in addition to JavaScript, in addition to CSS. So it's really plugins or themes are really just lumps of code that run on top of your WordPress with no separation. That's my biggest complaint, excuse me, about WordPress. There's no separation of execution. If something's executing within the WordPress environment, excuse me, it's game over.
Right. I mean, that's almost as cool as running your CGI scripts as root. I mean, your web server as root, right?
Yeah. Like everything runs as root within the WordPress context. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But they're not the only one, but they are the biggest target. And the problem is you can start making some of that stuff read only so it doesn't step on things, but then you wind up chasing your tail trying to fix anything, update anything. So
I found maintaining WordPress sites, you're very selective as to which code you run. Not that that's foolproof in any way, but if you're really super selective about what you run, you put yourself in a better position for security.
Yes.
So I actually ran into, just earlier today, I ran into a WordPress, a company that basically makes static WordPress sites. So they have a system where you can go in and you edit the WordPress, but once you complete your edits, it basically makes an immutable copy of that, where plugins can't be updated. There's no dynamic content.
You could do that like open source, Adrian. I think Larry talked about that. I think it's cool to see that there's a company that's supporting that process. And I've seen other proprietary solutions where WordPress is the back end where, like you say, editors can do what they need to do inside the CMS. And that basically just gets published out to a static load balanced, site that has all kinds of image caching and things like that on the front end. And that's what users interact with, but they can't interact with the back end. I've seen a lot of those types of models be more successful security-wise and performance-wise for WordPress.
And I just dropped it into the both the Discord, even though
we're not streaming tonight. Yeah,
but just for posterity, when people do, they can go find it there. But also in our Slack, it's a company called Stratic, headless and static WordPress hosting. It's pretty interesting.
Nice. I apologize. We're not streaming tonight. We're down. We don't have normal production resources this week, so we're getting by. Thanks, Dylan and Sam and Renee behind the scenes, trying to make this all happen.
Hey.
Let's see. That one. NMAP too. Well, since I mentioned load balancers, I thought this was a really good tip. Some command line switches to NMAP that will not stop scanning if a DNS name resolves to multiple IP addresses. And it will actually, so if you say nmap this domain name, if that domain name or host name resolves to multiple IP addresses, there's a flag for NMAP. What is the flag called? If you guys are pulling up the article, resolve all will scan all of the IP addresses behind that load balancer or DNS name, DNS record.
Oh,
now,
sweet.
That doesn't sound like anything earth-shattering. I understand that, but I think the point you have to realize is you're going to get different results oftentimes on all like 3 of those IP addresses, and they show an example. Like they're all not listening on the same ports, and that could be problematic, and you could miss stuff if you're not scanning as deep as you should. Which is interesting, Adrian, in the attack surface monitoring arena, to make sure that you have all those capabilities to dig deeper in all these instances, right?
Yeah, I mean, when you jump into like virtual hosting and stuff like that, where the web server decides to serve up different content based on, what forward-looking domain name you're resolving in from, or like there's a bunch of different ways you can do it, based on the referring URL, you can display different content. There's all kinds of different ways to get web servers to display different content. And that's just HTTP, once you get into other services. Yeah, there's different ways that you need to look at things and scan things to get a complete picture.
Yeah, and also I've had success loading the mobile version of the page, right? Sometimes hits a different API or different, shows you different content. It allows for different attacks.
Yeah, user agent. User agent is one of those that you can use to serve different content.
Back on the CVE front, what got me thinking about this was this story that CISA has added 41 flaws to its Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog. Now, when I first read this, I was like, they just added 41. Like, that's a pretty high percentage, relatively speaking, to the, I counted, 738, if you're counting at home, on the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog from CISA. But when you compare that 738 to the, what I just counted as 176,000 CVEs, I think it's pretty good guidance, right? In terms of maybe what you should pay attention to. 738 is not necessarily like a low number in terms of what you should be paying attention to. But granted, you're probably not going to have all those technologies if you can enumerate all those technologies and have a good asset management, which is a whole other discussion. But if you know 99% of what you have, which is where most organizations are at, having that 738, paring that down to what technologies you're using, that is, I think, a reasonable thing to focus on when we talk about security basics. You guys agree?
Yeah. Well, I agree. It's you got to know what you got. The interesting thing is some folks out there are getting the live cert feed, which have these in it. And yesterday the email was they added 20. Today the email was they added 34. I'm thinking somewhere between those is that 41. But if you think about it, trying to filter down to the actual delta, you better have some automation in here because you're going to go nuts, and then filter it further by your technology. You're going to need a bigger SOC otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a conversation I constantly have. This is probably my most common IANS advisory calls that I do for IANS is on vulnerability management and prioritization, stuff like that. And in the past, before CISA started doing this, Metasploit was kind of one of the best places to go to find, to shorten that list, to prioritize that list. If there's a Metasploit module for it, consider it fair game. Not that all the exploits in Metasploit are of the same quality. Like they actually have a rating system in there for how likely they are to work versus just crash the service, getting you remote code execution. But yeah, I think it really helps, that we have, as many sources as we can get that help us prioritize and cut down on lists of hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of vulnerabilities that people are pulling back with their scanning tools.
I still like that there are now easy sources to get that list of vulnerabilities. So you're not oblivious to the total problem set. And then filtering becomes a local problem. In the past, I remember not having the data coming in to begin with, which made it even worse. That was sort of a false negative.
And to your point, Lee, the best way to do this, I think, is to you really should make a list of all the software, hardware you have. You should have that inventory list, and you should be running that against this, because your scanners are not necessarily going to pull all this information back. Maybe they're not scanning these devices, or these are vulnerabilities that a scan isn't going to return. Maybe there's no plugin for it even, to return that.
Or no CVE for it as well, which you run into these like weird things. Like there could be an advisory, which doesn't necessarily tie back to all the specific CVEs, but some of them. Or there are certain conditions that could exist, like in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, that don't necessarily tie back to a specific CVE. So I don't think we should get hung up on counting CVEs, which is a segment of my next story, right? Or like CVE coverage. I think there are certain, I like the term exposures that you should prioritize, because a lot of times that exposure, okay, it's not a CVE, but to your point, Adrian, there might be a Metasploit module for like, hey, if this service exists and has a default password, you can use Metasploit to hook into it and do damage as an attacker.
And scanning tools are real spotty on telling you when you've got a default password on a service. Usually your only hint, that you've got some kind of configuration console with a default credential on it, is just an informational return that, hey, port 80 is open here, or port 443 is open here.
Right, or it's some default passwords and not others. OpenVAS, actually, when we did the test, Adrian, OpenVAS did a really good job of enumerating default credentials. I thought better than some of the other commercial offerings. Which is
it was actually an advisor for a company, a startup that made a product called IOC Crusher, and their entire thing was just compiling as complete a list of all the default credentials possible, and would scan a network and let you know if you had any of those services with default creds open.
I wrote an open source version of that. In fact, if you go to github.com/securityweekly, you can find our Python script that does that. Probably not as well, or not as well.
They're not getting acquired now. Thanks a lot.
Well, I also left it as an exercise to the user to acquire said lists and feed them into the software as well, right? That's the harder part.
Well, yeah, the real difficulty is maintaining that list.
Yeah, and constantly really adding to it, right? You're never really subtracting from it.
Yeah.
Or you're adding to it. Like, new version of this firmware comes out. Now the default password is admin instead of admin blank. So now you get to tell it, hey, when you find this device, make sure you do admin plus admin blank, plus maybe a blank username with a password, right? Depending on the version of the firmware.
The tech that never completely goes away. It's just that crap pile just keeps growing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
somebody
I'm really smart.
Using it.
Yeah.
I'm going to change my password to NIMDA. How's that?
Right.
Nobody will guess that.
Nobody will guess that.
Nope.
So,
what did I was talking about counting, because they were like, Microsoft has more. Where was my story on counting? What we were talking about?
Number 5?
It's the one just after the NMAP one.
Yeah.
Number 4?
Counting CVEs is really just silly. I mean,
or 5. Yeah.
Right. Multiple CVEs.
5, yeah.
So in my experience, and I worked for several years in vulnerability management, right? In this article, is talking about counting the Microsoft vulnerabilities are down for 2021. To me, that's like a useless, silly statistic, because multiple CVEs could be assigned for the same vulnerability. Hence, a lot of Linux distributions. Also, you get into advisories, right? Like, you could say Linux has 10 times more security advisories than does Apple. But granted, every Linux distro issues a separate security advisory for the same vulnerability. Now, granted, that could be a slightly different vulnerability because they've kind of forked the code and backported the patch. So therefore, like, it is really like a different advisory, but it's really the same problem, right? And then you've got the multiple CVEs assigned to the same vulnerability, or the same vulnerability has multiple CVEs, however you want to say that, right? Like, it makes counting just kind of a ridiculous exercise.
And then you have to consider that depending on who you ask, once you get into the prioritization space, the most of the research there says anywhere from 2 to 7% of CVEs could ever cause you harm, or have any real risk tied to them, and the rest are just noise.
Right. Back to the 738 of that we know are being exploited.
Right. Out of 100, and what was that on CVE?
176,000 in the research that I've done and compared notes with other people is for all the vulnerabilities out there, like roughly half have CVEs is like my best, not a whole lot of science behind that. But like 40-50% have a CVE. The rest maybe don't. Some vulnerabilities never get a CVE. Some vulnerabilities, like I said, are just like default password or missing credentials or whatever that never really get a CVE assigned to it.
I mean, what you're saying, the very end of the article talks about you can basically fix all the CVEs, but if you've still got underlying problems, you got default passwords or dumb passwords or whatever, you're not secure yet. You're not done. You got to do the whole job.
My favorite is like missing authentication. Like, how do we classify that? Where I've got a management interface on something, let's say, and I've just disabled authentication. Like, there is no authentication. Like, I've disabled it, and when you go to the device, you can just, printers do that, right? You go to the printer, and you can just manage the printer, and there's no password whatsoever, and you can take control of it. There's no CVE for that. There's not even like Adrian, your point, like a Vulns scanner is going to tell you you've got this web interface on port 80 that's listening, but not telling you what you can actually do with it.
Right. What was that total for CVEs? I'm trying to find that.
I had 176,000. I went to CVEdetails.com, ran on the main page. They list by CVSS score, the count in each CVSS score range, 0 to 1.
I see the total now. It's 177.36.
Roughly, yeah.
So I'm going to pop calc real quick and do...
Oh, wait, it just went up. It just crossed 100. I refreshed, and it's 177.036.
Yeah.
So nice. How did we just jump like 900 CVE? Where did we just get 900? Someone just loaded 900 more into the database while we were talking.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere, Paul.
I finished my batch script for the day. Here's 900.
Yeah.
I guess we're not the only ones having a cocktail.
Might have to look at the timestamps on those submissions.
Right.
Somebody's just automating something. But yeah, I just did a quick calculation, and it's 0.4%. What if you take CISA's list?
Yeah. No, it's good.
What is it? 738.
That's good. That's good math. That's good math to do with CVEs. I think that's a valid statistic to understand. Yeah.
0.4%. So less than 0.5%.
Right.
Are known to be exploited. I mean, how accurate that list is. I mean, even if it's double, right? We're 0.8%. Okay.
Yeah, and to go through the whole thing, you've got all the CVEs. Not all of them, are the type of CVE to have an exploit. The ones that could possibly be exploited is one number, and then for those where it's theoretical versus you could actually exploit it is another group. And then going down, does the exploit actually exist? Like maybe it's just a proof of concept. It's not a functional exploit. You've jumped down a size yet again. And then functional exploits, but not being used by attackers in the wild is another group. And that circle of what you need to worry about is shrinking as you go down. And then one's actually being used in the wild, then we get down to, what CISA has published here.
But being used in the wild means that enough people are running the software that it's attracting the attention of attackers, because we've all seen the CVE that is something oftentimes this is like IoT device firmware, right? Yeah.
Joe's WordPress picture rotator, that only works on WordPress version, 0.6.
This one IoT device camera had this vulnerability, and only in their build that they customized was it like full remote code execution
Yeah.
with no authentication. And there's like maybe like a few thousand of these devices that were sold, and a percentage of that are actually in production, and then a smaller percentage of that are actually exposed directly to the internet. Yeah, that might show up as a CVSS 10, but are you seeing people? So maybe someone saw in a honeypot, someone's exploiting it and adds it to a list, but I don't have that device.
So, and that's my frustration with this whole industry is like CISA's like, hey, here's the needles. Here's a list of needles that you need to find.
Right.
You know, and then you buy like a vulnerability management product and it's like, here's the haystack, boom, and just drops it on the needles.
Yep. Yeah, I still think there's a lot of opportunity out there with vulnerability management, attack surface monitoring, and asset management. It's
better than it used to be. They are correlating like exploitable stuff, and if you're using Rapid7, you get whether there's a Metasploit module or not. So you can filter and you can prioritize on a bunch of stuff now with a lot of these products.
And I liked Vicarious. I thought did a great job of telling you about the usage of that software. Like,
oh really?
You've got Firefox, and the version you have has a CVSS 10 and can be exploited. But like, guess what? No, like 1% of your users or less are actually using Firefox. So let's go ahead and pull it. Qualys gives that example too. I mean, I think Sumed actually said they found that in their environment, that they had deployed Firefox as an example and going like, no one's really using it. So rather than trying to patch it and keep it up to date, which we all know is a lot of work, it's much less work to just remove it from people's systems.
Yeah, reducing attack surface still has a ton of value. Getting rid of that tech debt. You know, like I've seen studies on like companies that just have policies where, they're obsessive about just cleaning out the old stuff that they don't need anymore or is out of support. Like that is a top priority, coming down from the top. And they don't have a ton of vulnerabilities because, everybody just has one browser. There's no like, well, this person has 3, this person has 4. Like maybe there's a couple developers that need different browsers for testing and stuff like that. But even that, there's services and tools for that now. You can use what's it called, like Browser Stack or something like that. There's
or a VM. I mean, you could use a VM that you just reset every time.
Yep.
Right, but I mean, there's services that make it stupid simple to test for like every type. You test your website in every type of phone. Test it for every browser. And just runs through all your tests for you. So, but there's less and less excuse to have a lot of this debt hanging around.
Well, and some of the practices. I mean, I remember we used to have to push on people to not just turn off something that was vulnerable, to actually uninstall it. Or if you've got 7 iterations of Java, get rid of the back 6. Let's keep the current one that's patched. And we're making progress in those spaces. I mean, when it comes to WordPress, don't turn off pub ones you're not using. Uninstall them so the code's not there to be exploited. That used to be like a stretch for people. It feels like it's pretty accepted now.
Yeah, I think that kind of falls into like the camp of keeping your house in order, right? And it's more of an IT management thing that has a security benefit to it, is cleaning that stuff up. I mean, I see it when I worked at Tenable all the time. We patched this. I'm like, yeah, but you left the previous 3 versions on the system that could still be exploited. Like, I think keeping that stuff maintained and cleaned up speaks volume. And that's not always easy. Sometimes it's hard to remove that stuff, but I feel like it's getting, I don't know if those in the trenches have to weigh in. Like, I feel like it's gotten better and the tools are better at allowing you to keep your house in order from an application perspective.
What I was thinking about you when I read the headline on your number 9 story, and this is along the same lines of, there's a Kubernetes API problem, but more importantly, why are these exposed to the internet? It seemed to me we shouldn't expose those, but you've got way more experience in that space than I do, Paul. Am I naive?
Complexity breeds vulnerabilities. That's really what it comes down to. And configuring like containers, like taking your application, whether legacy or new, and putting in containers is an exercise. Then orchestrating those containers in a system like Kubernetes is another exercise in a great deal of complexity. And in talking with Rich Mogul, he's like, a lot of people don't really need to put it in Kubernetes. He went so far as to say, like, a lot of people shouldn't even be using containers. Like, if they use the cloud correctly. Now, Rich can say that because he's been an early adopter of cloud technologies since 2008, right? When AWS had, 5 or 6 products as opposed to 156 products or more today. But I think what I got from Rich was people are over adopting Kubernetes and not understanding the complexity, and in an effort to get their application to run and scale are leaving a lot of these security exposures behind, one of which is the Kubernetes management ports or APIs are exposed to the internet. And if you do that with Kubernetes or you do it with Docker, like it's a great way to just invite attackers in to mine cryptocurrency is the most common attack vector there.
Can I lock those down so that they aren't exposed and still be functional?
I think you absolutely can, Lee, in both of those cases with Kubernetes and Docker, but it requires a close attention to detail as to how you're configuring the software, which already is very complex to get right, especially in Kubernetes, where again you're orchestrating multiple sets of containers within Kubernetes.
Yeah, you can secure it, but don't break it, right?
That's the trick. Yeah, but oftentimes, like Rich was saying, like you don't need. There's cloud services and cloud native technology that allow you to accomplish the same things without the complexity of Kubernetes. I mean, then you have to manage the cloud. But I also feel like there's great tools in either one. But I also feel like cloud security posture management and security of your infrastructure as code is pretty well developed. And we've seen some pretty cool vendors. Cloud Needy was one, right, that got acquired. Like the really cool technology to be able to do that.
Yeah. So,
and that exists for Kubernetes too. I mean, lots of Kubernetes security companies as well.
Yeah. No, I get it. I mean, you don't have to be buzzword compliant to be successful. And there's, take a look at what's built in, what's there. And I suspect there's a lot of documentation on all this stuff on how to do it right. Probably not enough good advice on, you don't need it to go that far.
Yeah. And also I think if you're going to use Kubernetes and you have a business case for that, you should adopt some security technologies around that, which you're going to be likely early adopters, maybe early-ish adopters in doing that, but you probably should take a look at that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Where do we want to go next?
You want to talk about CFAA?
Yes. Researchers got a free ticket now. Which I thought this problem was already solved to a certain extent.
It's good to have it out in the public though, like said, for them to actually state it instead of researchers crossing their fingers hoping they're not going to get any kind of backlash.
Yeah, you don't want to leave loopholes that if we decide to go after a security researcher, like there's some things we could use to do that. You're right, Adrian. It's nice to have language that there is protection for good faith security research. And like we've always said, it comes down to intent. I feel like they shouldn't prosecute people if their intent is good.
Well, and I think it's a sign of the times changing too. Like we were just talking about CISA, like all the great work that CISA's doing, like the, White House is asking for zero trust and SBOMs and stuff like that. Like we're just seeing the federal government really, take some major leaps forward in their thinking and what they're, expecting agencies to do.
When you apply a bill of materials to firmware, you know what it's called?
What?
An F-bomb.
An F-bomb, of course.
Oh,
nice. Very nice.
So does that mean if you have a firmware bill of materials, you're dropping F-bombs?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's a bonus. I think if you let people call them that, they're probably more likely to do it, right?
Right.
More likely to get it done, just so that they can say it.
Just so we can say everyone should be dropping F-bombs.
Yeah. Just so they can put that slides for their monthly tasks accomplished.
We dropped 13 F-bombs this month.
We'll never get old.
No,
we'll never get old.
Well,
but yeah, I think some, folks on the federal side have always understood that they need the public's help.
mm-hmm.
And it's has a real potential for chilling effect if you start trying to prosecute people who had good intent, even if maybe they caused a little damage or something like that. It's an issue that we've had on the other side, is researchers understanding the full extent of damage they could do with some of the research. And then of course you have the issue of people saying they're doing research, like labeling it as that when their intent was otherwise. But those are more edge cases. I think in general it's good to get it out there that, hey, you know what, like this is, if you're trying to make things better, we're not going to come after you. But I mean, that's still for what? The courts to decide.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still vague enough that, they get to determine what that actually means in each case.
I think this type of incentive, if you will, is important, because I think if any one of us were to find a vulnerability, write an exploit for it, okay, now what? And if we feared some level of prosecution from law enforcement and or the government and or the company, that are going to come after us, we might go sell it on an illicit market. Now, I want to also kind of throw out there, like, most of us could go build that network. Like, if we don't know the illicit market where we could sell something, I at least think that many security researchers out there, or even any of us on the show or listening, were to be able to do that, like, we would kind of ask around and be able to build that network. However, if we're incentivized to go to a bug bounty program, if we're incentivized that we're not going to be prosecuted under the CFAA because we had good faith and we're doing good faith security research, we're not going to go down that path, right? And I don't want to use this like a threatening thing to governments and or standards bodies and or companies that, like, hey, if you don't provide us a good path, we're going to always take the bad path. That's not the case. I think we should always try to incentivize what they deem as good faith security research to have a good path to do the right thing. If those good paths are closed off, a couple things happen. Either I keep them to myself, right, and share them with my close friends, or I start selling them on the black market, or like you said, you just say, Adrian, like, I just tell the whole world before you patch it, and that's the better of all the scenarios, in my opinion. I'm on the side of full disclosure if push comes to shove.
You anarchist.
It is anarchy. It is a very anarchist thing to say. I know. But I think it's better than keeping to yourself, sharing it in a small circle. That small circle kind of leaks out, or, selling on the black market where another nation state or terrorist or bad actor picks it up and includes it in the next, ransomware and malware kit, for example, or uses it to do heinous things. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's, another thing I do a lot of advisory calls on at IONS is bug bounty and vulnerability disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, just a lot of companies out there, just still perceive like 100% of researchers and bug bounty folks
as a threat.
And they don't understand so I have to explain all the different motivations, behind there. Sure, there are people out there trying to make a living doing it. And they're going to get pissed off when they file an XXS on a static page and and you just close it. They're going to bitch about that, but yeah, a lot of people are just very mission oriented that do that kind of stuff, And if you receive a submission from them and you give them nothing back but silence, yeah, it's gonna be a full disclosure at some point. Like, that's just how that world works, and there's a lot of education still to do on both sides.
Yeah, I think compensation is nice, but to your point, Adrian, recognition goes a long way. silence is the kiss of death to security researchers. They're like, really? Like,
Yeah.
I'm just going to release it out there, right? Shenanigans are probably even worse because now everyone's just angry, right? There's a lot of friction involved, and that usually doesn't have a very good result because now you're going to make it public, but you're also going to talk about all of the contention and friction you had with the company that ultimately just makes them look bad. Now you're in an even worse situation. The best situation is to like communicate, accept, and ultimately fix. Or if you're not going to fix, that's fine. And tell them, look, I'm not going to fix it. Go ahead, release it like I'm not going to fix. I mean, Microsoft's done that, and we pick on Microsoft for doing that. But now that I verbalized that in the context of this discussion, I'm like, you know what? That's a better scenario than everyone being pissed off, right? Because Microsoft, look, this is our decision. We're going to accept the risk. We want you to publish your research. We'll recognize your research, but we're not going to publish a fix. And we may push to fix it, and sometimes Microsoft eventually does, and that's cool. But at least like everything's out in the open. Like it's an open discussion, which is always the best scenario.
Yeah. Secret squirrels were risky. You know, if nobody talk about this. It doesn't exist. It never happened. No, that doesn't work.
Apple, I think, would like to think that it works, but it doesn't. It just, again, it causes friction. Like, if you're gonna fix it, say you're gonna. Don't silently fix it either. That's the other thing that pisses people off. Right? That's another. It's a lot of scenarios we went through, right? But that one scenario where I'm a researcher, I disclose it. Maybe they acknowledge it, maybe they don't. But they fix it, and they fix it silently, and they don't even recognize that you were the researcher or maybe one of 2 or 3 researchers, because oftentimes you've got multiple researchers reporting the same bug, which also speaks to another aspect of this, that like just because I found it doesn't mean I'm the only one in the world that knows it exists, and we can prove that. Intel's last release of fixes for a lot of their firmware based systems and subsystems, it was like a dual reporting. Intel's like, we found this internally and it was reported externally as well, and we fixed it, and we gave credit to both the internal research team and the external researcher. Like, bravo. Like, that's cool.
So I know that a lot of the, I'm obviously watching things like the iOS updates, and those security updates now are having an ever increasing list of researchers credited for each one that's discovered and reported. I don't know if they're being as comprehensive as you might like. But that list used to be non-existent, and now they're actually saying, you know, Anonymous or Project Zero or any of those.
Yeah, it's been a lot of pressure on them.
They're getting there.
Yeah, they've had a lot of pressure on them. Yeah. Apple has.
And it's a different world with you know, what do we call it? Responsible disclosure, vulnerability disclosure programs, whatever you want to label. You want to put on it. It's a new
coordinated.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, responsible implies that they're being irresponsible if they make any other choice, and that's kind of a hot button for some folks.
No, I don't want to push the hot button. I mean, I'm you know, I would say that a lot of sites have a rules of engagement for doing this kind of work, and I would encourage you to follow them, because that's how you get the paybacks and whatnot if there's a reward. But I don't want to slap morality in there. I just want to say, you know, don't do harm. Don't get yourself arrested.
Yeah. I mean, so disclosures, that's all solved. We can move on now. Next story.
Yeah, let's move on.
Well, and if we move on to Zoom, speaking of disclosure, it's solved, right? 2022 22784, right? 8.1 XMPP message parsing issue in Zoom client for meetings. Source reported by Yvonne Frotrick of Google Project Zero, right there in the source.
Boom.
So there you go. Zoom doing it right.
I didn't even know that Zoom used XMPP. That's the old Jabber protocol, right?
I think that's how they implement their chat and some API type functionality. So in this advisory, and I don't pretend to understand all like the ins and outs of the technical details as to how this is accomplished, but this one was interesting because it was a set of vulnerabilities that, if chained together, you could do some really interesting things, such as trick a vulnerable client into connecting to a rogue server potentially leading to arbitrary code execution due to an update package downgrade in the Zoom client. So like that could almost be, I think that could be 3 vulnerabilities, at least 2. So tricking a vulnerable client into connecting to a rogue server, maybe that's 1 vulnerability. Arbitrary code execution, that's another vulnerability. Then package downgrading is maybe a 3rd vulnerability. And once you can get, I thought that was an interesting class of vulnerability, vulnerabilities and exploits leading up to I get the client to downgrade where then I can exploit more vulnerabilities. So like, how do you vulnerability management that, right? Like we're vulnerable to something that could downgrade it that leads us to vulnerabilities that we already fixed. Like if ever I felt defeated in an IT security or management role, it would be if I'm trying to patch vulnerabilities that undo my patching that I worked so hard to roll out new patches for Zoom in this case, right?
I mean, looking at this effectively, it sounds like if you are already on a Zoom session, so here's your, privilege escalation situation again here. This is a CVSS 8.1. You could potentially send a message as, the official hosts of the Zoom call or something like that, and say, everybody click here for something or another. But it sounds like there's a big social engineering piece of this.
Yep.
So it's actually, it doesn't sound like there's any direct code execution. It's pretending that you're authoritative and getting people to click links is what this sounds like to me.
But Zoom has like an auto update kind of feature. I don't know if that crosses all platforms. Like on Linux, you have to click something and kind of opt into it. But I think on Windows and Mac OS, it auto updates.
They're much more. I think the client does the update itself. So I would expect it to work on Linux also. That was one of the big lessons learned in the pandemic when their user base jumped up a bajillion %.
Right. Discord also does a really good job of auto updating as well. Like even on Linux, it annoyingly it will not let me run the older version. It's like, no, there's an update. Like you got to go get it, or maybe as time goes on, like it auto updates, and maybe major versions. It's like you can't run that .deb package anymore. Like you got to go get a new one and update it before you can run the client, which I like. Now. I appreciate that. I'm like, you know what? It's fine.
Yeah. I think Microsoft started with that, doing auto reboots to apply patches, and then you saw browsers will, go from green to yellow to red, but still won't auto relaunch themselves. But a lot of these, that's becoming pretty much the standard now is, you know what, we're going to inconvenience you because the alternative is way worse.
Yeah. Which I agree, provided the updates don't break shit, which sometimes they do, but
yes,
it happens. Finding hidden cameras in IoT devices.
I was looking at that one. That one's pretty interesting.
I've always, like, I don't know, I've never been that paranoid when I go into a hotel room. Maybe I should be, to look for other recording devices. Like I always felt like that was like a government thing, or you see it sometimes in mafia movies, and like, sweep the room for bugs, right? And they always have this really cool like tech gear that could sweep the room for bugs. And but the like variety of things that you could look for, especially today, really runs the spectrum, to pun intended, I suppose. Could you right? You could have, like, if there's a listening device in a lamp that has some proprietary RF signaling in it to get the the data in and out of that device, you've got to be able to look on that frequency, or have something that's detecting radio wave communications and at a wide variety of spectrums to be able to detect it. But when I looked into this one, it was basically Wi-Fi that was using RSSI to determine the position of the device. And I'm like, well, okay, or you could just have Kismet with, and fire that up, or Enzyme, or any number of open source tools, quite frankly, that have the ability to do monitor mode on your Wi-Fi device, especially to look for devices that are transmitting on Wi-Fi.
But Paul, there's an AR function. It's going to overlay where it is with the camera. It's in the metaverse.
Yes.
We get to throw the word metaverse in here, and it's a whole new product.
It is a nice feature. They're marketing
if it worked.
The marketing
if it worked. Like, how accurate do you think this is in real life
but
compared to like what they're showing here?
They're marketing the user experience. They're the flying Mario shooting fireballs in my analogy, not my analogy, but the analogy I used in our earlier meeting. Right?
So you're going to have to explain it now. Nobody's going to know what the heck you're talking about.
So I was listening to a podcast, great podcast, My First Million. Love the show. And I don't know if they invented this or there's a couple of other sources that had, but they were basically like, look, I'm going to explain marketing. Like if you've got a startup or, early stage company especially, and you want to understand marketing, the only thing you need to understand is this analogy. And I'm like, this is going to be complete crap. And then he explains it, and I'm like, no, actually he nailed it. And it's Little Mario, Big Mario. Many of us have played Super Mario Brothers, right? We know you start off as Little Mario, and you're running through the world, and if you find a mushroom, you get bigger, and you find more mushrooms, and before you know it, you can fly and throw balls of fire, which who doesn't want to fly and shoot balls of fire? So in the marketing analogy, your customer is Mario, and your product is the mushrooms. The biggest mistake people make is they talk about how awesome the mushrooms are, and not about how cool it is to fly and throw balls of fire. And I'm like, oh, you shouldn't talk about, so the moral of the story is you shouldn't talk about your product. You should talk about the benefit to your customers, how the customers' lives are going to be better once they have your product. And some of the articles I found recently give there's lots of different examples, right? About like, here's how you're marketing your product. And if you adopt Super Mario Brothers marketing mentality, here's how your marketing would change. And you're like, oh, like, of course, that makes total sense. And you can then you start thinking of examples where you've seen marketing that's like, oh, they're making it so I can fly and throw balls of fire because that's really cool.
It's so funny. Like you jump into cars or something like that, and they're totally obsessed with the mushroom. Like people are obsessed with quarter mile times, 0 to 60 times, Nürburgring lap times and shit like that. And like nobody's telling you how you're going to feel driving it,
Yes.
and there are these much cheaper, much less powerful cars you can buy that make you that are way more fun to drive, than like a Tesla Model S Plaid,
right?
For example, which, going super fast in a straight line is a neat trick, but
hey, 0 to 60 in 2.6, 2.7. Like ridiculously, is it? Oh, is it under two? The Plaid is under 2 seconds.
1.99, but that's on a drag strip.
Dude,
with
that's
like different. It takes like 8 minutes for it to get the battery to the right temperature.
Oh,
but
right.
But cold, like on the street, yeah, you're looking at like 2.3, 2.5. It's face melting, ridiculous. Like,
but I feel like that speaks to the user experience because when I saw that number, I'm like, tell me about street legal cars that are 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. You're into like Lamborghinis, McLarens, maybe a certain model Porsche. Like there's a finite list of under 3 seconds 0 to 60 street legal cars.
But you probably can't tell me the 0 to 60 time of a Miata, of a modern day or any Miata.
Right.
Like,
and if that's 3.3, is that equally as fun? Like, am I going to notice that?
Almost nobody knows that off the top of their head. But any enthusiast knows it's a fun car to drive. Like that's all they need to know. It's a cheap, fun, thrilling car to drive. No idea what the 0 to 60 is.
And how does this relate to when we shop for security products? We want the ones that are fun to drive. Is that make us throw footballs?
Well, I'm relating back to your Mario thing. You know, sell the experience, not the product, not the. Like some people want to see specs. Sure, sometimes specs are important, but it absolutely relates back to products because like when I was
how does this make my life better? How does this product make my life better as a security professional? Right?
Yeah, when I was doing those product reviews, like you shouldn't care as much how many malwares out of the 200 samples that it caught. You should care more. Like, do I have enough people to run this? First and foremost. what does it cost? Can I even afford it? In terms of licensing, what does it cost in terms of people? Is
my team going to be really effective with it?
Yeah.
Right? When I used to compare vulnerability scanners and the CVE coverage, I'm like, folks, like that's a metric. If your security team is really awesome with this product and it fits with their personality, their style, their process, and it fits within your business process, that should be your first and foremost criteria. Not like the 0 to 60 analogy, right? Like not how many CVEs is it going to cover. It's how effective you can be with it. What's the user experience? Are people going to want to use it, right? In security products, is it going to sit on the shelf or are people actually going to use it?
Well, you got to have some reality in there too. I mean, I was thinking about, as we're talking about this, I think the movie was called Crazy People. They had people in an insane asylum doing ad slogans, and the Volvo, they're boxy, but they're good. I was reading an ad for a product today, and it said something along the lines of, remediate vulnerabilities 10 times faster with fewer resources. And I'm thinking, well, that's just motherhood and apple pie. What's reality? I mean, that's the 2.3 second takeoff, right? You got to get some reality in there. You've got to, but they're good.
But it's not a bad problem. But it's not a bad problem to solve. They're focused on the problem to solve, which isn't bad, right? Like it takes me a really long time to discover and remediate vulnerabilities. You can help me with that. Yeah, solve my problem.
So that's exactly what Paul was talking about. That is the correct way to do it. It's just that's got to be achievable.
Right. Yes.
It's just false marketing.
Adrian brings up a great point.
Don't set off my snake oil alarm.
Right. And Lee's point too. Your product has to work. That's one thing you're not going to get around. Your product has to work as advertised.
Yep.
Yeah. And if it's awesome, cool, even better.
Right. So the Lumos system, I think, is what got us on this, right? We technically can say there's a lot of ways I can get to 0 to 60. There's a lot of ways I can find Wi-Fi devices in my hotel room. But if I have one that's augmented reality and shows me a map, that's a friggin' cool user experience, cool. Right? Like that's an experience that I want to have. And so hopefully they're successful. Although I kind of like Kismet and I would just do that. But
can you get this somewhere?
I'm not that
it's a product, isn't it?
There's a Usenix paper here, so I think it's just like a research project.
Oh, I gotcha.
Project. I don't think it's commercialized.
Gotcha.
We need a Larry Pesci and a Josh Wright to create the app on our iPhones or our Androids for us. I mean, that's what we need.
It seems like it'd be doable. Building this out of existing open source stuff. Yeah.
Someone's gonna hack a Oculus app.
That'd be neat.
There's your 2.3 seconds.
Have you seen magnet paper?
No.
Before? So it's basically like two sheets of plastic laminated together with like iron filings in between them or something like that. It just looks like green, laminated paper. And you lay it over something with magnets, like an iPad keyboard tray is a lot of fun, for example. And it'll basically show you a picture of all the magnetic fields as you slide it over the magnets.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Which is kind of what this, like if you go to the website, where they have the Lumos story here on Hacker News, that's kind of what it reminds me of, where you're looking at, on a camera, it's overlaying where the IoT devices are in the room. And that's kind of what this.
It's almost like those infrared cameras you've seen, right?
Yeah, exactly.
PSP security is open source. This was an interesting kind of take on cryptographic protocols in the lens of Google, if you will. So to address some challenges, they developed PSP, which is a recursive acronym for PSP Security Protocol. It's a TLS like protocol that is transport independent, enables per connection security, and is offload friendly. So at Google, they say we employ all of these protocols depending on use case. So they use TLS for user-facing connections, IPsec for site-to-site encryption, and interoperability with third-party appliances, and PSP for intra and inter data center traffic. I thought it was pretty cool. And like the moral of the story for me was, like, don't invent your own protocol, especially encryption. I mean, unless you're Google. That might be an exception to that rule. And so they've open sourced it. But also I think a really like interesting view, like summarized pretty nicely, of which protocols you should implement for each use case, right? Like just because you have a hammer, not everything is a nail. Like there's specific use cases. Like we didn't develop our own encryption protocol to replace everything. It was for this specific use case. I thought that was pretty cool. And we'll see how it holds up security-wise now that it's open source. No comments.
It's freaking built into their custom kernels and stuff. It's like, whoa, it's just going to work. I mean, it reminds me of what if I decided to, instead of building IPsec, then I built something better in.
Yeah, but
And
for a
it's
specific use case, right? Like IPsec and straight TLS didn't work for their use case, so they created their own. Which again, I mean, if you're Google, you do that, and you know, building it into their kernel. Like, I mean, Google, I think, prided itself on, like, that was how Google got started, right? Was they wanted to solve a problem, and they didn't want to buy off-the-shelf hardware, so they bought like really cheap hardware that
Linux,
that had a higher fail rate with Linux, and if a board died, they'd just replace it, and they had tens, thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of these devices, and that's how they powered the search engine.
Yeah, and all the major public cloud providers produce their own hardware at this point, I believe. Google Cloud, Azure, and AWS.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean,
well, like they take bits of hardware and put them together, kind of thing, right? For customization, no, they design their own chips,
write their own firmware. Yeah, they fab their own chips, write their own firmware. Like they wanted to get more disk density. So they actually had to build custom server rooms because the amount of disks they got in a single rack was like 2,300 pounds, something like that. And that was above what standard raised flooring is rated for.
Yeah.
So they had to build their
engineer,
own
like literal building engineering to support their architecture.
And like a Cisco router is built to do a million different things.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's got tons of features shoved into it, which is a problem. Because, you know, when you're running AWS AZs, like there's a very finite number of features that you need, and you want to specialize for those features and make it as efficient as possible, have as little code in there as possible. Like you said before, complexity breeds what?
Well, I feel like that's FPGAs are that example. I need to do one specific set of tasks really fast. So I need to customize the code for an FPGA to accomplish that. But I find it interesting they've taken it to the next level, where it's their own hardware design and their own firmware design. That's really interesting.
Yeah, well, AWS runs their own custom firmware on their diesel generators because by default the diesel generator has circuitry to protect itself and shut itself down if it sees any issues. And again, to your point earlier. Like they would rather it be disposable. You know, they would rather it damage itself because it's cheaper to replace the diesel generator than to have the downtime that would occur with it doing a safe shutdown. You know, so they customize that.
Yeah. Well, I remember back when I was first getting into security and talking to the high performance folks about, you know, their issue with the security devices we wanted to use is latency was fatal for them. And now you look at the cloud providers where they're doing the same sort of thing. They've got their own customized gear because they're trying to get throughput latency down, as well as, you know, it doesn't need 7,000 features. It needs these 3, and that's what it's got to give you really reliable, just what you need. And it beats going out and buying a warehouse full of white box computers that you're throwing away a few hundred every week.
That's really cool. Targeting researchers is interesting. Kind of back to the security researcher thing. I've seen this before, and I'm always leery of it. Like, I feel like back in the day when we had like Millworm and Dave Itel reminded me of one, an exploit. Like before there was Exploit DB is the more modern one. There was Millworm. Millworm kind of became Exploit DB, but before that there was other sites we used to go get Packetstorm was one. He mentioned another one that I had forgotten about.
Are you talking about the fake Windows exploits?
Yeah, because like when you got the code, like I've always been pretty diligent about if I'm going to go run an exploit, I'm at least going to give the code like a cursory look.
Yeah.
To make sure.
That used to be a thing, like screwing with people with the code. Like, I mean, sometimes they do something funny with it, but usually they just break it in some simple ways so that you had to at least know how to read the code to get it to run.
Yeah. And mileage varied when I tried to get, some exploits were broken on purpose, like you said, Adrian, and you had to figure it out. And sometimes I would figure it out, but the greatest cheat or hack on that was to find someone else that had figured it out and posted it. And then download that version. Like, thanks, you did the hard work, the harder or a portion of the hard work, right? The hard work is writing the exploit. Purposely breaking it is a skill in and of itself. But then like reverse engineering that and making it work, and then I would just download that version if push came to shove. But in all those cases, like you're running someone else's code, and I would always scrutinize the code for like, is it trying to steal my passwords? Is there a backdoor? Is it exfiltrating data? And like whatever language it was in, I'd like look for certain, keywords. Like if it's going to do bad things, it's likely maybe going to use this type of function or call. And so I want to look for those and make sure that it's not poning me as I'm trying to pwn.
You have a story for that this week. Your story number 13 is exactly that.
Yes. Yeah. Python and PHP libraries, right? It's a supply. So it's interesting, Adrian, that it's a supply chain thing in legitimate libraries, but also a supply chain thing in exploits that security researchers and pen testers are downloading, which is interesting.
So let's describe what we're talking about here. Like the story is, I think it's number 4 under Lee's stories. Fake Windows exploits target InfoSec community with Cobalt Strike. So they're posing as exploits, and they are.
Just not for what you think but it's the binary. Like anytime I see an exploit that doesn't publish the source code, but it publishes the binary, I'm like, red flag. And then I'm like, if they have the source code for it and the binary, I'm like, I'd rather go compile the binary and read through the source code and then compile it than to just take their word that the compiled binary is whatever it is. Because oftentimes it's not, right? Like there's other stuff in the binary. So if I do run that, maybe it's in a VM or some other sandbox environment if I'm going to run it at all. Because then my other option is now I got to like reverse engineer the exploit to make sure the exploit is going to pwn me versus the stuff I actually want to pwn.
Well,
oh my God.
We've taken care of that for you on this one. We are going to pwn you.
Yeah.
And it even fakes like the text you would expect to see, like it hits that dopamine hit, like when you run an exploit and it's like,
oh, you popped a shell,
found target, like popping shell, blah blah blah, like you get all the text out of it, that's going to give you that great dopamine hit that makes you think, oh cool, like I've got an exploit and it's working. And then it's going to be a complete dump. You go white as you realize, no, it's actually hacked your system.
I just hacked myself, basically. I let someone else hack me by running this exploit.
This is like, can we call this a script kiddie vacuum?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. I think most of us pen testers, security researchers, right, like do this level of scrutiny. And I think this is a good public service announcement to those that are going out experimenting, trying to get exploits working. Like we've all been there, like trying to get exploits working for the first time. Don't run the binary code. Like just don't. Just don't. Unless you can either vet it yourself or work with your friends that have more experience that can help you vet that code. Because it could just be hacking you, as in this case, and it's enticing when they publish a GitHub. It's like, hey, and I've seen these GitHubs, some fake, some real. They're like, hey, there's this CVE that was published for Windows, and here's the exploit for it. And I also check with my friends as well. Before I download it, I go to some of my friends, you know, if you're just getting in the field, like pop in a Discord community that you've gotten to know some people, like ask around, like, hey, I saw this exploit code. It was in this GitHub. I haven't downloaded it yet. Like, don't download it and then run this, but like tell me, like, is this legit or not? Like, validate it, crowdsource the validation before you start running things on your own machine or even within a VM, which could be dangerous too.
Yeah, but you know, think of it like this: you've got 3 hours left on the pen test, and then you got to leave. You got to run to the airport, you know, and
Dude, dangerous.
you're trying to find
Been there. Yeah.
Yeah, you know that some vulnerabilities are present, and you're looking for working exploits, and one of the places you're going to check is GitHub.
Yep.
You're going to scan GitHub for that CVE. You're going to find this thing. Like, you got limited time, and that's where your first principles come into play.
You're like, YOLO. Let's do this.
You got to check. You still got to check.
Yeah, and worse if you're in a customer's environment and you run an exploit that's been backdoored like this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
on
like,
their network.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, also libraries that have been backdoored. What I thought
jumping
was
down to your 13.
yeah, my 13. Yeah. So CTX is a minimal Python module. Lets developers manipulate their dictionary objects in a variety of different ways. Python data objects are really awesome. I don't think I've used CTX as a library. So what I thought was really interesting as well was the package, although popular, had not been touched since 2014 by its developer.
No, they're both like this. So these are both abandoned
PHP is
projects.
the same way.
And I absolutely hate this kind of reporting where they're like, oh, the pass framework, I don't even know why they say it this way, has incurred over 2.5 million downloads. That doesn't even make sense. But yeah, that's over the life of the product.
That struck me too. Agree, Adrian.
And of course, the moment, so basically what happened is they moved the product, they moved the project somewhere else. And the moment they did that, you know, daily downloads went to like 0 or 1 or 2 a week. And I think it was showing like there had been 2, you know, since they had made this change to this package, you know. So here's the story saying over 2.5 million downloads instead of, yeah, there's only been 2 since the nasty code was put in there. So
right.
No, this did not affect 2.5 million people. Nobody's auto updating from it. You know, it's mostly, yeah.
Are you auto updating from it as well? So some of my development processes that require some extra work when we talk about this.
But you can tell people haven't, because for the last 3 months, there's been like 1 or 2 downloads per week.
Yeah, right. But people should be auto updating it, right? Like I'll often set up the DevOps pipeline to go
right. Sure.
Every time you build in development, you're pulling down the latest library, and if it blows up in development because you updated a library, like you got to go fix that. But the missing piece to that I need to get a little better at, and a lot of organizations are better at doing this, is yes, I have this build process where I'm going to build it with all the latest versions, but I'm also going to put some security scrutiny around everything that's new. And I'm going to review those new libraries going down. So in case of Python, I'm using CTX as a library. It hasn't been updated since 2014. So I'm always trying to pull down the latest version, but there is no latest version. So it's a moot point. If I'm not pulling down the latest version and someone updates and puts a backdoor in it, I'm not going to get that update because I'm not updating it automatically. To your point, Adrian, right? But if I am auto updating, I have to see that, hey, in this build, I've got a new version of CTX. Give me the diff, show me what's changed, validate that from a security perspective and go, like, is that all good? Then validate that from a functional perspective, then go put it in production. And that's a hard thing to implement.
This is absolutely newsworthy that somebody's actually going out and doing this, you know, because it could happen to a very popular package that people are auto updating from. But But also, a bit of a lesson there that, maybe you shouldn't have your AWS keys stored as environment variables, or even better, what you should do is go to canarytokens.org, create fake AWS keys, and put those in as your environment variables. Then the moment somebody tries to do this, pull this kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And also validate those updates, right? I think sometimes my advice is make sure you're always updating your libraries, but you have to validate those updates, then put them back in your software.
How would you validate them? Would that be a manual code review where you're looking at diffs of every single
Yeah, it's
package?
So some people I've talked to, agents, a great question, do a combination of like a manual code update, but also kind of like a threat hunt, right? Like, hey, go build the latest libraries and monitor any network communications. If there's stuff going out that shouldn't go out, then did we download software that's
not going to help you in this case, though, because they're pulling your AWS keys from an environment variable.
And where are they sending those, though? They have to get those out?
Yes, they do have to send them off, but yeah, no, it's a good point. You look for certain behaviors, right?
Yeah, but in that environment, back to your point, in that environment, have fake AWS keys that you're downloading new libraries. So if they do leak it out, or put it in a sandbox environment that is, allowing the TCP or, TCP IP communications, but stopping them in a sandbox environment. So you observe like, hey, this would have called out, but like I stopped it, but you still see the attempt, the initial connection request, but it's stopped in your environment. But that's again, this is not easy stuff to implement.
So two big, and it's kind of the same lesson from the SolarWinds. From
it's a supply. This is absolutely supply chain.
So if this executed in your environment, you would have seen a new connection to a Heroku app that you had never touched before.
Right.
If you're looking at your outbound network connections, and that would be a big hint. That should stick out like a sore thumb. And if it doesn't, then you got some work to do on your detection capabilities. And also just reading environment variables, that haven't been read before by this package. Yeah, I think that's a little bit harder to, create a detection for. But it's same thing with the Log4j, looking for weird outbound network connections or disallowing them wherever you can. Is kind of the low hanging defender fruit here to solve for.
But protecting your secrets too in a secrets vault is
instead of environment
so
variables.
much better. Rich Mogul and I talked about this, and he's like, dude, because I asked him, I'm like, Rich, this is like one of the most common attack vectors against applications is to steal any secrets within the application. A lot of different ways to skin that cat. I mean, obviously getting them in a GitHub repository is bad. The next level from that is protecting them in environment variables that are injected at runtime through production in your application. Oftentimes they do live on the file system in some capacity, but are injected inside of your container or into your cloud native app in some capacity, but then they live as environment variables. Better way to do that obviously is AWS Secrets Manager, or what did we talk about? There's the protected secrets. There's some sysadmin functionality to AWS. I forget what we called them. Rich knew the name. Go back and watch that webcast. Rich and I talked about it in ways in which to protect secrets.
Okay.
So I
can't remember
you're
the
really
acronym,
taking two approaches here. You're making sure your code's good, but you're also making sure your environment's not too vulnerable if something does happen.
Yes, or HashiCorp Vault, you're right, is another way to do it, independent of your cloud provider. Rich was kind of a big fan of like pick a cloud provider, develop in that, and use their secrets management as part of that.
Yeah.
Speaking of being tricked, we talked about being tricked from a exploit. This one's
11.
My 14.
14.
There was evidence presented. Now, if we covered this last month as a vulnerability, I apologize. It turns out like if we didn't vet our sources, it's a hoax now. Like there was a 7-zip vulnerability that got a CVE 2022-29072. Recent evidence pointed that this was a hoax. really wasn't a vulnerability. Again, it kind of goes back to vetting your libraries, right? You got to vet your sources for vulnerability information. Just because of vulnerability, in this document that I linked to, links to all the news sources that pick this up as a vulnerability that we all need to pay attention to. But, people dug into it and was like, this really isn't a vulnerability. It was actually a hoax. Or maybe they're saying it's a hoax and it wasn't a hoax because they discovered the vulnerability and they want to use it. I'm not sure which. I haven't done that depth of analysis on this particular vulnerability to know, was the original one a hoax? Was the people calling it a hoax in hopes that you would not patch this vulnerability, or is it just something you don't need to worry about?
I mean, the big insight here is that nobody does due diligence on this stuff. Like they see one blog post about it, all the media outlets are just going to copy that.
I think that's a flaw in our validation, though. If I see a couple of news sources, but I see 6 or more, that's validation of that this must be something real, because obviously it's that whole thing. Oh, well, there was a sociology experiment in New York City, right, where like someone was being murdered and everyone in the apartment complexes thought everyone else was going to respond to it, and no one did, and someone was killed.
Nobody did.
It's a famous, anyone that studies, went to school, especially for sociology, has studied that experiment. There's a name for it. There's people that went to school for that or know of this that are yelling it in their cars and at the gym at me right now, right? But that's the same thing with this particular hoax. We see all the news outlets covering it, maybe a dozen, and we're like, well, at least one of them validated it. But no, after the first one that didn't validate it, everyone thought it was real and kept publishing articles, and no one validated it. Just like no one went to help the poor woman who was murdered in those apartment complexes in New York City. It's the same thing.
Yeah, so we actually had a similar story last week where Lee, I think you were there, the 666 encryption thing.
Yeah.
Where whoever made this thing, who I'm not sure is entirely stable, basically created a Crunchbase entry, that they had gotten a Series A at a $1 trillion valuation. And it appears to be one guy, and like I haven't been able to get any actual encryption experts to look at it, but it's I mean, it's just red flags all the way down. This thing, and a bunch of people covered it just because he made that entry in Crunchbase. Like it came up in a lot of my funding newsletters.
That's interesting. And this was a crypto company?
666encryption.com. Just go there.
That's almost like a no-name security or redacted security kind of name.
He leans into it with the Number of the Beast and all. He really leans into it as a theme.
That was like what was the fake security company? Something but
fake security? Yeah, it was just FAKE. It was an acronym.
There was the fake certification that people created. It was an ass.
Oh yeah. That was it was Application Security Expert.
Yes.
Yeah. And they were selling hats, so you could have an ass hat.
And then you can create fake personas of fake companies, and they'll win awards and get job offers. That's a thing you can do as well. I know people that do that kind of thing.
And it's not because somebody was gullible or didn't do due diligence in that case. That's just because they're just happy to take your money and they don't give a shit.
Right. It all falls in the same category, that we're talking about, which is interesting.
Ultimately, even as a reader of a story, like you have to do some, especially in this age, where, people who maliciously want to lie to you about stuff have some major publishing power and a lot of eyes and a lot of money to throw at getting eyes on their stuff. You've got to learn how to do your own due diligence.
I mean, there's been
certainly in cybersecurity.
Yeah, and there's been half a dozen to maybe a dozen stories in 742 episodes that we've, I think, pretty close at least to 100% of the time, like on subsequent episodes, we're like, yeah, that was proven not to be true. Like we're sorry. Like it's hard to fact check every single. I mean, we do our best to make sure that like what we're covering is actually news. But like I'm telling the listeners right now, like sometimes we do cover shit, and like if the listeners want to help us crowdsource that and validate it, like we take that feedback, like 1,000% we'll take that feedback, and we'll be like, yeah, like what we covered that wasn't true or was a complete hoax. Oftentimes it's not. I mean, very rare it's a complete hoax. It does happen, but sometimes it's like that wasn't the whole story. Like there was a lot of hand waving and shit going on too.
Yeah, we should do a webcast on how to do some of that due diligence validation work. Yeah, I think that would be handy for the average person.
I agree. What's up with like ransomware stories lately, Adrian? I think you and I both had like
weird ransomware stories,
like Fringe. I think of the TV show Fringe, right? Like, which is a great show, by the way. But like Fringe ransomware stories, because you had one where you paid the ransom by showing that you were helping a homeless child.
Yeah, it's called so it's cloudsec.com, and it's called the Goodwill ransomware. And I don't know, I'm not able to load the page right now.
Maybe it was a hoax.
Maybe it was a hoax.
It sounded like it could be a hoax. Speaking of hoaxes,
it was really weird. Well, they had analysis of the actual malware. I can't load that link now. That's weird.
Fake news.
Yeah, maybe. We try a different browser.
But that was when you said like the ransom was like not money.
You had to take a video of yourself like doing good things for people and stuff like that.
I mean, not opposed to that necessarily. Like that's, but I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. Like that's.
Ooh, I wonder if they're. I wonder if somebody's DOSing. Can you get to cloudsec.com? SEK?
Cloudsek.com. This is the show where Adrian fishes Paul. Actionable threat intelligence for your digital assets.
That's just my network then. But yeah, the link is.
Hold on, I'm going to the blog. Emerging sophisticated Pandora ransomware? No,
I'll repost it to the Slack.
Okay,
it's the latest one in the Slack. Yeah, I don't. Slack loads it fine. I don't know what's wrong with my network. It's broken, I guess. But
let's see if I can load this. Yeah, Goodwill ransomware forces victims to donate to the poor and provides financial assistance to patients in need.
But what if they hit a hospital with this ransomware, and then people die as a result of that? Like it's like, and I'd be really interested to see who the victims of this are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I don't think there's any real way to do this in a victimless way. You know, like maybe they can sleep at night and feel like they have, but I'm very skeptical that this can be done in any kind of positive way.
Interesting to compare that to the victims that didn't become victims, made their ransomware actors victims. So this story, National Bank hit by ransomware, trolls hackers with dick pics was the title.
Yeah.
This could totally be fake news, by the way, speaking of fake news.
Right.
So instead of paying the ransom, bank representatives responded to the ransom negotiation by making fun of the hackers. They then proceeded to post a link to a dick pic while stating, do really heinous things and stop locking on our bank networks. Yeah. I mean,
now all the people listening to this in their car with their kids in the car, their kids are like, Dad, what's a dick pic?
Probably should have put a warning on that before we went straight to like dick pics. I mean, just
tell the kids it's a photo of Dick Cheney. You're fine.
I tell you what, it was a headline from bleepingcomputer.com, reputable source, right? Again, going back to like vetting your stories, but that was the headline with them, which is kind of interesting. But like, I mean, the balls on them to do this to the ransomware actors.
What could possibly go wrong?
I mean,
Was it their own pictures? Was it? You know what? I don't want to know.
TMI, Paul. TMI.
TMI. I mean, there are. I think it's interesting. I mean, this is kind of a funny story, interesting usage of that particular type of picture, right? But I think it's interesting the kind of fighting that organizations, countries, and basically white hats are having with ransomware groups at various levels. I mean, it's a battle. Like Costa Rica, we talked about a couple of weeks in a row. Like they're actively battling ransomware groups for control of their systems. Kind of an interesting trend.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure pictures of your junk is the right response. It's a response, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, it's not paying.
It is not paying. I mean, in some ways, the ransomware actors are paying.
Yeah.
So many jokes.
I think we've run through all of yours.
Lee?
Yeah, and the ones I was interested in, we covered a bunch of them. I thought it was interesting the Clearview story, my number 3, about a group collecting information on UK residents. It's interesting because the UK has had the cameras and the intersections in places for years, and you don't know what sort of limits are on things, and here they are saying, no, you can't scrape images from social media of folks. And
that's they got it. Social media and the web, sure enough. Yeah, 20 billion faces.
Yeah, just a couple.
That's just to feed their AI, basically, right?
Yeah.
Well,
and if your social media profile is public, isn't that fair game?
This isn't to feed the AI. This is to match against.
Yeah, but isn't that also, feeding the machine learning engine in a way? Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like, there's the machine learning engine that's like, this is a person, this is not a person. And then there's the next level, like, how do I match this person to that person? The more data that they have, the better they can match it. Adrian's walking down the street, and I know it's Adrian because I scraped all Adrian's social media profiles and matched the same face, and I've got more data points that when Adrian walks in front of a camera, I need almost less data points to say that's Adrian than I did if I didn't scrape all your social media.
Or depending on what data they're pulling, they could tell you, based on this CCTV footage, we know Adrian walks by this corner on this street at 5 p.m. every Friday.
Or God forbid you check into a place and they scrape that from social media.
Right. Like it depends on what's attached to these photos. Like you can think of some pretty nasty stuff you could put together.
Right. But if your social media profile is public, is that just not public information?
Yeah, I mean that's it's problematic, because there's public, and then there's stuff you can get with an account, and then the question is, are you abusing the terms and conditions of that account? Like we had the case where somebody used the API in Clubhouse to download all the data.
Yep.
And Clubhouse was like, as designed, have fun, enjoy your free data. And then
well, I think there's public, there's I have an account, and there's I limit it to friends within that platform.
So Twitter, Google, and YouTube have all sent C&D letters to the company, saying that they violated their terms of service.
Interesting.
And Facebook demanded that they stop scraping their data, but apparently didn't send a C&D. Don't have enough lawyers, I guess. They're just busy.
That's really...
And then the ALCU jumped on them as well. I mean, holy moly. They're having a bad day. Week.
Yeah, like they maybe should have checked some things before they just started sucking down data.
Yeah, like It's interesting where those lines are, though, of what's public and then, like,
And
it almost seems like
it could-
how you access that public data is what's under scrutiny. Like, yeah, it's out there, but if I write
Right.
automated programs to scrape it, that crosses a line. I mean, now we're getting into
Well, it's
Weave's case potentially, but like
Wasn't
lots of
there-
other cases too.
wasn't there a Chinese app or was it a filter like the thing that made you like showed you how you would look if you were old or something like that? They used that to collect a bunch of facial
Right.
data, and like there's nobody to send them a C&D from that because all the people that
They
installed
opted
that app
in.
opted in.
Right.
So I think this was a while ago. This probably all this data gathering happened before that app. For all I know, this could be the same company. I don't know. I'm not familiar with Clearview AI.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to have a legal expert to discuss like what this article in Lee, what you put in here, like illegally scraping. Like what's the difference between legal scraping and illegally scraping? Right? Like that's interesting.
That was an interesting term they used. All I could think of is you're not violating the EULA, or they're leaving it out. If I scrape my own data, it's okay, but if wait a minute. Yeah, it gets weird.
Yeah, the use cases, if you go to the company's website, are anti-fraud, for identification, like, making sure somebody else isn't taking money out of your account, basically, when you show ID, like they can do a match in that. And then law enforcement is the other big use case on the website here.
Right.
And
I'm assuming that's to identify people. You bring up their photo and it says, oh, yeah, that really is Adrian, or it's likely Adrian.
Right.
Remember, there was something similar with the Russian-Ukraine where they were using recognition apps to identify dead soldiers, which is cool as itself. But how did you get the data is the interesting question. Hopefully,
Paul, you and me are going to have to trade faces at some point, like to escape the just face off.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like I think
I assume somebody got that movie reference.
I think this, but I think this warrants like a larger discussion about and it's interesting because it crosses international law as well, that's really gets like, I'm not a lawyer or attorney or expert on law, and you want to try to understand what the laws are here in the U.S., but then like, how does that translate into the UK and other countries as well? And what if it crosses, like that gets really, a discussion about scraping is interesting, because I was also hearing about how startups will like have an idea and they'll employ scraping of like their competitors and what their competitors are doing and collecting in order to make decisions about their own product and see where they are in the market as opposed to their competitors, and there's some kind of scraping involved with that. And I think every single one of us on the show and listening can think about scenarios where you're like, I need to go scrape some data. And whether that's for a business purpose, whether that's for a security purpose, I think a lot of us have written scrapers. And what's the laws behind that? Kind of interesting, right?
Yeah. So interesting you mentioned that, because back in the day, like a side project me and a buddy had was compiling all exploit databases and putting just a single search engine in front of them. So like you were talking about Millworm, and there was Exploit DB, and then there was VulnDB. And we were scraping a lot of that stuff and bringing it in. And most of them were fine with it, but the risk-based security folks were not fine with it.
Right.
And
they noticed.
That was when, so if you ever noticed when VulnDB became no longer public.
Yeah.
And like you had.
That was why. You spoiled it for the rest of us.
It was us.
Yeah.
We screwed that up.
Jake's a good person though. So, I mean, he has reasons for that, right? But there's lots of reasons to scrape. Like, I gave loose business. I'll give you a more concrete business example. Like, I want to know who's sponsoring conferences, right?
Yeah.
Like that's useful information. So maybe I go scrape. What are the laws around that to be able to do that? I mean, I also, like I scrape to get YouTube stats because the view count is public.
Yeah,
and the best way to get that sometimes is scrape. Like most of us in cybersecurity that are in a more technical role and write some code, like we probably all have a large percentage of us have written code to scrape some shit before.
Yeah, like last time I checked, LinkedIn.
Oh, Google's Google's the greatest place to scrape. LinkedIn hates it when you scrape and will
the company
ban the shit out of you, right?
So the company page on LinkedIn, like one of the ways that I would estimate private revenue is I had a formula that would use the number of employees listed on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Like it was never perfectly accurate, but for tech companies, I found it tended to be like within 10% of accurate.
Right.
So I had a formula that would use that to generate or to estimate private revenue. And you could not get it from an API. You had to scrape it. You had to scrape the company page to get that. And I never understood why they wouldn't include that in their API. So
yeah, I mean, and Google indexes public data. So if LinkedIn blocks you, one of the hacks, and this was years ago, I don't know how true this is today, but like if you wanted LinkedIn data, you would just go to Google and search for LinkedIn stuff and scrape it from Google, because if you scraped it from LinkedIn, they get really pissed off.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this was years ago. I don't know what it looks like today, but
crazy.
Is that violation of terms of service? Is an API abuses? Could be.
Could be. I think I've seen terms of service where they specifically call out scraping.
Mm.
I worry about more simple things, like somebody just looks for an image on the internet, grabs whatever they have and put it without considering, that it's somebody owns that image.
Okay, I just found an article titled "Web Scraping is Now Legal."
What?
Here's what that means for data scientists. In late 2019, the U.S. Court of Appeals denied LinkedIn's request to prevent HiQ, an analytics company, from scraping its data.
Oh, I remember that case. Yeah.
Happens to be LinkedIn.
Yeah, because LinkedIn was the most, and always has been the most strict about scraping. And also, like, if you've ever interfaced with their API, which I've written code to interface with their API, they are the most locked down out of any API I've ever worked with. They are the most stringent about what you can do with their API.
Well, I mean, they're the only company in the world that has that comprehensive a work history database.
And they're owned by Microsoft. Does Microsoft own LinkedIn?
Yeah.
Is that true?
Paid a bunch of money. I forget how many billions. It was like double-digit billions.
Well, I guess privacy-wise, I'd rather have Microsoft own it than Google. To be honest,
26 billion. Yeah. I don't know. Like at least
26 billion. 26 billion reasons to be wrong. Something like that.
And mostly what you get from an internal LinkedIn is spam.
I think if you employ Dylan past 10 o'clock, you have to pay a fine.
Probably.
Yeah.
Is that we should wrap up now? Because we're just rambling about scraping.
We've gone through all the stories, I think.
We have definitely hit all the stories. Lee and Adrian, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. That concludes this episode of Paul Security Weekly. Over and out.